to be honest, even the whole concept of taking a sick day was difficult for me. So now even taking a sick day while I'm literally right by my bed is also hard. But I have been making the efforts to take it, because if you're not well, you're not well. Okay, so in my defense, I'm not an inherently messy person per se. I just am tidily challenged, if that makes sense. One of the things that is clearly sort of a problem for me is keeping my space tidy, because I'm spending so much more time in it. I don't really go outside the house very much anymore anyway, for obvious reasons, coronavirus and all of that stuff. So what that means is I'm always in here. I love to make excuses for myself, even though these excuses are valid, but I do think one of the reasons why my space sometimes gets quite congested is because I'm spending all my time here, really. I mean, not only do I work here, I spend my recreational time here, I eat in here, and yeah, I sleep in here. So it's like I spend all my time in here. I don't actually have a living room either, so I don't really have a communal space where I can kind of chill outside of this room. This is pretty much it. And I think when you spend all your time here, because you're not traveling and you're not doing all of these other things, it means that mess starts to build up. So I'm gonna try and clean that up first, because I do find that I work better from home when my space is tidy. And unfortunately, with a chronic illness, this isn't always possible, and you often want to try and do it in moments where you have the energy and spoons to actually tidy your room. Today seems to be one of those days. It's a lower pain day, so I'm gonna do that first before I even continue with the rest of the video. But I'm also not a fan of putting the camera on and making you lot watch me tidy up, so I'm just gonna do this instead. Tidying all of this in 3, 2, 1. Not perfect, but definitely tidier and easier to work in. I learned something really important about myself as a chronic illness person working from home in a pandemic, that I like to overplan to fill up my time to fill the void of despair and sadness in my life. No, but seriously, like, when this pandemic thing started and I was told I had to work from home, I was quite neutral about it, and then I tried to kind of make myself extra positive about it. I was going to be better than I was before lockdown, right? Because I had all of this excuses, you know, the travel stuff, blah, 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 blah. Now I'm at home, there is no excuse. Your commute is from here to there. Overpacked my schedule. I told myself I was going to wake up at this time every single day. I was going to get this done. I was going to exercise, yoga, meditate, all of that, then do my job, then do the stuff I do for this channel, You Look Okay to Me, and then even have time to learn a language, French. I'm sure you're wondering if all of those things happened, and the short answer of it all is it did not. So, what actually has been helping? Well, I can say in terms of a general sense of working from home or living at work, that I take regular breaks, or at least I try to as much as possible, taking time away from the screen, because you're looking at it all the time, standing up, going on walks, especially outside. You know, I literally stay in my room all the time because I don't have a communal house space, so it is good to sort of get out, but that's easier said than done, because if you're shielding, that's not something you can do, and also if I'm in a high pain day, that's also not something I can do as well. So it really does depend on the day, and it depends on who you are. I think something else that's helped is actually trying to make sure I have a lunch break. So having that 1 hour time for myself, whether it's just watching a show while I'm eating or having a nice little bit of recreational time in the middle of the work day, that's super important too. It's very easy to sort of just run on and continue the day without a break. But one of the major things I think that has been really important is taking sick days when needed. I think I sort of felt like when I was working from home that I wasn't entitled to sick days, or I didn't deserve them, or I shouldn't take them because I'm literally at home and there's no excuse, like I'm just chilling, like I shouldn't be able to have sick day. But at the end of the day, if I have a chronic illness, it doesn't matter if I'm at home or if I'm in the office. If I'm not very well, I should not be working. And to be honest, even the whole concept of taking a sick day was difficult for me. So now even taking a sick day while I'm literally right by my bed is also hard. But I have been making the efforts to take it, because if you're not well, you're not well. It doesn't matter where you are. What did I come in here for? I think grapes. I totally forgot that my fridge beeps, so I thought I was gonna do like a cute little fridge thing. See, I don't know about anybody else with a chronic illness, or maybe this applies to people that don't have chronic illnesses as well, but I found that I was extra hard on myself. It just sounds like a kid's getting murdered outside my door. I live right by a school. Sorry, anyway. I found that I was extra hard on myself during lockdown and during this pandemic because I felt like all of my excuses that I used to make for not being as productive as I was now disappeared. Now I literally didn't have to commute anymore, and what that meant is that I worked extra hard. And subsequently it meant that I actually burnt out more during lockdown than I did when I used to go into the office and used to have to do things in person. And then that becomes like a cycle of self-hate, because then now I'm burning out more, which means I have to lie down and sleep more. I actually was having more frequent sick days in a sense. And then I started having ideas about myself like, look at you, you're actually even worse during lockdown. Why are you not doing anything? Why are you even like sick more? Because you don't even have to be as physical as you used to be, blah, blah, blah. And it just became this mess. I think that was probably around the middle of the 3-month lockdown that we did in the UK. I just had a really bad mental self-image because I had an idea of all of these things that I was supposed to achieve in this time, because all of my excuses were gone. And it took some time to sit down and figure out that actually these weren't excuses. This is just a real thing. I'm still not perfectly there yet, but I'm definitely a lot better than I was in the early parts of lockdown earlier on in the year. Anyway, that is the vlog for today. You know, this whole process is kind of weird for me, so please bear with me with this type of content. I'm still trying to work out what works and what doesn't work. Do you work from home, or are you living at work? Do you have a chronic illness as well? What are some of your tips? And I think lastly, just to add, there's so many tips about working from home that are sometimes not accessible to everybody. So it's important to just kind of mitigate the circumstances as best as you can based on what you can and can't do. Anyway, do you work from home? Are you living at work? And do you also have a chronic illness as well? Comment below some of your tips and how you've been managing it during this time in the pandemic. Did you like this video? If you liked the video, make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel You Look Okay to Me, and follow You Look Okay to Me on all social platforms. That's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and the like. Be sure to share the video around because more people can watch it and maybe learn or help and gain something from it, and turn on the notification bell so you can be made aware of whenever I upload a video. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.